Welcome to Untaught Essentials. I'm Jeremy Hunter. Just in time for Valentine's Day, this episode is dedicated to understanding pain. I think you'll find it a riveting conversation. Given there's no shortage of pain in the world right now, I thought it would be helpful to hear the voice of someone who's enormously skilled in helping others work with pain, Vidyamala Burch. Vidyamala is the co-founder of Breathworks in the United Kingdom and specializes in helping people deal with pain, illness, and stress. Vidyamala's life circumstances make her a uniquely powerful teacher. She lost the full use of her legs 45 years ago and has used crutches and a wheelchair for mobility for decades. She also lives with a paralyzed bowel and bladder. Despite that, if you could see her rather than just hear her voice, you'd see that she is a radiant human being. This conversation is meant to help people face whatever circumstance they may be in and perhaps even grow from it. Welcome to Untaught Essentials. This episode, we're very lucky to have Vidyamala Burch, who is co-founder of Breathworks, which is a mindfulness consultancy training firm focused on helping people deal with pain, illness, and stress. She has come at this not through a very intense life experience of her own, of living with spinal injury for over 40 years. And so, as we know, each episode focuses on some fundamental topic around being alive. And this episode, I thought we could focus on the topic of pain and how do we deal with pain in our lives in a way that is helpful and maybe even growth oriented. And there's nobody better to talk about that than Vidyamala. So welcome, Vidyamala. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to be here with you, Jeremy, and thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah, our pleasure's ours. So you want to tell us a little bit about yourself? So you've 40 years of living with spinal injury and obviously the pain and issues around disability that come with that. And share us your story.
Okay, yeah.
What is that like?
So, well, it's been quite a journey. I'm 60 now, and I injured my spine when I was 16. So, that's by far the majority of my life that I've been living with this, what I used to see as an enemy, and now I would probably see as a companion. I definitely wouldn't call it a friend, but a companion along the way that's taught me many, many things. So prior to my injury, I was very sporty, athletic, did a lot of mountaineering. I took my body for granted. I had a very comfortable relationship with my body. It was a body that worked very well, and I never really thought about the gift of that. I just lived my life. And then I was lifting someone out of a swimming pool doing life-saving practice, ironically. And my back just started to hurt. And it turned out that I had a condition where my spine had fractured. It was a congenital weakness, and it had fractured doing that lifting. So I had a fusion the following year, and then that went wrong. So then I had a very major corrective surgery the same year. So I had 2 major operations when I was 17. So I went from being this athletic, sporty girl who was on the conveyor belt towards thinking I could do what I liked with my life. And then here I was with pain. At that point, I was still fairly mobile. I mean, over the subsequent years, my mobility has really declined, and I now use a wheelchair and crutches for mobility. But at that point, I was still able to walk. I also missed a very crucial year of school. So I didn't actually end up going to university. So I'd always assumed I'd go to university. I was going to get a vet degree. That was my plan. And I was going to be a wildlife officer in New Zealand. That was my dream. I was going to live in the wilds, this sort of mythic wilderness life. New Zealand is still fairly predator-free nation, but nonetheless, there are some rats and so on that have come in on ships. So they do the breeding programs for some of the native birds on wild remote islands, and you have to swim on and off the islands. so that you don't bring any predators with you. So that was my myth. I was going to
Wow.
be one of these people that lived on these wild islands, and I so wanted to do that. So everything came crashing down. Well, obviously I couldn't live that life as a disabled person. And I never ended up going to university and getting my vet degree. So that was, it's very interesting. We talk about disability and pain from the physical point of view, but of course it has a big social and emotional impact. So what I'd hoped to do with my life, or my dreams, came crashing down. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting is the way I dealt with it. And I think this is very common. This is the way human beings deal with catastrophe very often, as we go into denial. So basically what I decided was that I was not going to let this thing get me down. I was going to overcome this thing. I was going to be a hero. And you've got to remember, I was brought up in New Zealand, and New Zealanders generally are quite pioneering. New Zealand women are very tough. So I sort of took on that mantle. And I split off from my body. So obviously I've done all this work over the decades, learning how to work with my mind, learning how to work with my body. And I can now see how destructive that initial reaction was, to split off from my body, live in my head, believe I could do anything, continually push myself, continually have physical flare-ups. And I ended up working in film. I got a job in the film industry as a film editor. Sedentary, not good for my back either. Working very, very long hours. So 60 hours a week minimum on contract. And of course, if you're in denial, that's the perfect kind of job. You just split off into your head and you overwork, you become a workaholic. I was very alienated from my emotional life. I quite enjoyed my work, but looking back, it was never sustainable. And then when I was 23, I was in a car accident, and I was a passenger in the car, and the driver drove into a telegraph pole on the open highway, and I fractured another part of my spine. Awful whiplash. And you really don't want to get whiplash when you've got a fused spine, because there's nowhere for the shock to go. It all just gets jammed in your body. Concussion, various other injuries. So I had 4 months off work, and then remarkably and foolishly, I just went back. I just went back to working 60 hours a week. So interesting. So even having another catastrophe, I went straight back into denial, straight back into, this will not break me. I will overcome it. I will be a hero. And of course, that really was unsustainable. So a couple of years later, I effectively had a breakdown. It wasn't ever called that, but I went to see a doctor who said, you need to have complete bed rest right now. Go home, go to bed. Don't get up for 2 weeks. And I went to bed, and just that was it. It was like someone had pulled out the plug. I was completely and utterly exhausted, mentally exhausted, physically exhausted. And I didn't get up for months, basically. I had a collapse. I was 25. And so at this point, I'd also lost my career. So I'd lost my health, and now I'd also lost my career. I'd lost any financial security and stability. But then I had some injections that, again, it was a kind of medical disaster, really. They'd lost my x-rays. I had these injections into the part of my spine that they're injecting into joints that I didn't have anymore. So my bladder became paralyzed, and I ended up in an intensive care ward. Again, very, very interesting. As I'm saying the story, I think for someone like me, who was so willful, so driven, this kind of deep denial, perhaps I needed to fall very, very low. I needed to absolutely hit rock bottom before I would even begin to entertain the idea that perhaps there was another way of dealing with my situation. So I was in intensive care. And I had this experience one night that completely changed my life. I often talk about this. And I had to sit up. I'd had this particular test, which meant I had to sit up for 24 hours afterwards. I hadn't sat up for months. I couldn't sit up. So I was in a kind of impossible predicament where, again, it was fascinating. I was having to do this thing that I could not do. And that's very interesting for the human mind. You're up against something that is rationally, logically impossible, and yet you have to do it. So here I was in the middle of the night, agonizing about how I was going to get through till the morning when I was going to be able to lie down again. So I had one part of my mind saying, I can't do this. I'm going to go mad. And I had another part of my mind saying, but you have to. I can't, but you have to. I'm going to go mad. No, you're not. And it was just getting more and more and more intense. It was like hell, really. And then at a certain point, another voice came in. And this other voice said, you don't have to get through till the morning. You just have to get through this moment and this moment and this one and this one. And you can do that. Yeah. And my experience changed. It went from being completely contracted and tight and tormented to being only relatively tight and contracted and tormented. But there was a bit more space in there, a bit more ease. And I got through till the morning and I felt profoundly changed, because of course, within that voice, you just have to get through this moment. You just have to live this moment. It raises questions about what is time, what is space, what is consciousness, who am I? What is this idea of time and the morning that I'm agonizing about? When the insight was, we only live now. We only live now and now and now and now and now. And as I talk about it, you know, they're just words coming out of my mouth, aren't they? But it was completely sort of earth-shattering because it came in to such a state of intensity. It's the most intense night of my life, without any doubt. So I woke up in the morning with these questions. Well, you know, what was that? What was that about? What's time? What's space? Who am I? And I absolutely knew that that was the truth. I absolutely knew that we only live life one moment at a time, and that the key to freedom is to somehow make that the compass of my life, the you know, the question of my life. How do I do that? How can I be fully awake in each present moment? And my life has, ever since that moment, which was in July 1985, that's been my quest. That's been my quest. You know, how can I be present to my life as it's happening, no matter what the content is? Yeah, so that was really remarkable. I had a few other experiences in hospital. I had the hospital chaplain come and do a meditation with me. And again, that completely changed my life, because he taught me that my subjective experience can change depending on what I do with my mind, with what I do with my awareness, because he got me to remember a time and a place where I'd been happy. I took my mind to the Southern Alps of New Zealand, where I'd been ecstatic. And maybe it was 10-minute practice, and I felt really different. And prior to that, I'd never thought I had a mind, really. You know, I was just alive. I'd never really thought, oh, I've got this capacity of awareness. That had never occurred to me. So again, the chaplain showed me, I have a capacity of awareness. Even though my body was broken, my mind was at least potentially healthy. So that it was like, how can I be present and how can I train my mind? And those have been the things that have directed my life ever since.
And how old were you at that point?
25.
So it's
and in
quite
fact, you know, in some ways it's sad that I had to do all that when I was so young. And in other ways, it's brilliant, because now that I'm old or older, I can see, well, actually my peers' bodies are less perfect now. Everyone's having to learn to deal with pain and discomfort and a failing body when you get to late middle age. And I've had all these years of practice. It's brilliant.
Yeah, just last week, my best friend of 30 years finally decided to go on a 10-day meditation retreat. And so, yeah, it's like you get to catch up. The world gets to catch up.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But I mean, just reflecting on this story, I mean, it was like that procedure was a kind of initiation into a whole other realm in a way.
That's true. Yes, I'd never seen it like that, but that's true. It's like the world broke open everything broke open, and I'm not sure that I would have heard the message any other way.
That's
Sometimes, that sort of, I think it was some kind of an inside experience, to use that language, but it rose up out of hell. And very often people think about sort of breakthrough experiences being very blissy and ecstatic. Well, mine just rose up out of hell and broke the world open.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, like the whole passage of day into night and returning to day again, and the person that's coming back is not the person that left. And it's something that happened to you. It wasn't something that you didn't go on retreat or went to a workshop or something like that. It sounded like it was just something that you got visited in some way.
Exactly, completely out of the blue. And I've often wondered, what was that voice? What was that voice? I think if I was Christian, I'd say it was the voice of God. I'm not Christian, so I can't call it the voice of God. Maybe it was a higher self. I don't know, but it was very clear, very, very clear. You don't have to get through till the morning. You just have to live this moment. Crystal clear as a bell. Yeah, a message from the beyond of some sort.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, how frequent and common these experiences are, and except, as a culture, there's just no place to talk about it in a way without being seen as a lunatic. And and yet there's I've had my own version of that, and I know I have colleagues, at the university who've shut the door and say, this is what happened to me, and I realize, oh, this is probably happening to a lot of people a lot of time, and because we don't have a cultural fluency for it, we kind of pass it off, and so that's,
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because I've never thought of it as special. I've never thought, oh, look at me, I've had this amazing experience at all. I've just thought I had to listen. It was such a desperate plight that I had to listen. But as you say, I suspect we're often having these visitations, to call it that, visitations. And perhaps, maybe that's something that the listeners could think about. What visitations have you had, and what could you listen to? Because they can completely change our lives.
Yeah. And did you take it seriously or not, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And the other thing that struck me was that you had like the staged quality of this. Like, okay, we're going to give you one challenge. Are you going to get it? And then, okay, oh, you're not getting it. And then you got another one. Are you getting it yet? And then in a way it sounded like you really had to be pinned down to say, okay, you're going to get this now. And how that pattern shows up so many times. What you said, you had to like be taken to the depths of hell to be able to see it. And I've noticed that, we don't, I call them the 5 Ds. I don't know if I can remember: death, disease, divorce, disaster, drug addiction, right? That really, you have to hit for many people, we have to hit a wall, because the momentum of our life goes in such a strong direction that it goes so strongly in a particular direction that you're not willing to change that direction until something really intensely tries to get your attention. And I wonder, have you, in your own life, you've had that, but then in working subsequently for the last, however many decades of people in this kind of experience, like, and I asked that with the context of, being January 2021 at this point, we've lived as a planet through something that is a wake-up call of sorts, I think, and it's very painful, and for many people it's been very tragic. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation was that, there's so much intense pain happening for any number of reasons right now, and that people, the knowledge and wisdom you have is something that the world really, I think, needs to hear. And so with that kind of context in mind, given that we've had this collective hitting of a wall, how do you in a way make sense of that, or how do you think about that given your own experience?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's such an extraordinary time, isn't it? Well, I suppose the main thing that I've learned in my own life since climbing up the ladder out of hell a bit more is that the wisdom is, how do we respond to what happens, not what happens. We can't control what happens. Life throws curveballs, life throws us things. We can create conditions that will, maybe make it less likely for disaster to happen, but nonetheless, sometimes bad things happen. And the wisdom is, how do you respond to that? And of course, we can have a huge amount of agency in that. We don't need to feel passive or victims in the face of that. And that's what I've really seen over the last year is we have a global pandemic going on. We can't stop that. We can't do anything about that. I mean, obviously, this behaviorally, we can abide by the rules and try to avoid spreading it and all those sorts of things. So there are things we can do, but nonetheless, collectively, we now have this virus circulating in the population of the world. And as I understand it, it's probably not going to go away. There'll be the vaccines and so on that will manage it, but it's going to be endemic now. And either we can rail against these things, or we can think, well, this is really, really hard. Moment by moment by moment by moment, how can I meet this with presence and with choice? Because the behavioral outcome of mindfulness is choice. The behavioral outcome of mindfulness is what's going on mentally, emotionally, and physically. So you face it. You don't do what I did 40 years ago of just pretend it's not happening, which is what I did in my denial phase, which I managed to keep up for 10 years. It's like, this is happening, everybody. So moment by moment by moment, what am I feeling? Oh, I'm feeling upset or fearful. Okay, what's a wise response to fear? I'm going to breathe. I'm going to drop my breathing deep in my body. I'm going to allow my out breath to go all the way out. I'm going to notice my thoughts. I'm going to stand in my courage. I'm going to drop my awareness into my feet, and I'm going to feel my body, and I'm going to feel my courage, and I'm going to move into the next moment with my head held high. Yeah. And that's the way we can begin to navigate these territories. But because there's huge confidence that comes with knowing that the wisdom is about your response. Because if you think that that wisdom arises if you get life on your own terms, you're always going to be disappointed. Or if you think, well, I can be happy if there's no pandemic, that's not going to work, because guess what? There is a pandemic. But if it's like wisdom arises when I can acknowledge, yes, this is happening on this planet right now, and I'm going to be real and honest about my emotional response, but I'm not going to get swept away by it. So it's this middle way between suppression, pretending it's not happening, or getting swept away. We just breathe, we rest, we stand in presence, and we move into the next moment, and we just take it one moment at a time. We're in the UK now. We've just gone into lockdown again. And it's all a bit mysterious because we've obviously got the vaccine rollout happening. So on the one hand, the government's saying, hey, guess what? It's all going to be better by middle of February. On the other hand, they're saying the lockdown might go on till April. So we don't really know. Now, one could really catastrophize about the lockdown and think, oh my God, I can't bear it. Not again. Not again. It's the middle of winter. It's much, much harder. Or you can think, actually, going right back to my experience in hospital, 3 months away, even the concept of 3 months, that's entirely a mental fabrication. 3 months, what does that mean? It's just 3 months of moments. And yet I can live this moment, and I can live the next one. And then eventually 3 months will have passed and something else will have landed in our lap. So I think that's the teaching I would rest upon, is putting all your effort into responding, creating wise response to what happens, rather than thinking you can control what happens, because that's what the pandemic is teaching us. There's so little we can control, really. So little we can control. We think we can control loads of things, but actually, life is happening. And I don't want people to take this the wrong way or pessimistically. but I'm not convinced we've learned our lesson yet as a species. You know, they always said there was going to be a pandemic. If you're going to have things like wet markets, you're going to chop down all the jungle, all the forests, all, you know, they've always said we were going to have viruses. And
have we learned our lesson yet? Right?
Have we learned our lesson? You know, and if you look at my experience, there had to be a lot of suffering before I started to learn my lesson. So again, I don't want, you know, I'm very aware this is going out as a podcast, and I don't want to come across as the bearer of doom or seeming to be negative. But I think if we just go back to the way we were, probably that's not sustainable. But it's very interesting as a species, how are we going to transition to a more sustainable world? I really don't know how that's going to happen. And it might be that we do just go back to the way we were for a bit and then something else happens. Or can we really learn? Can we really learn? And that's interesting for me, the fact that the virus is mutating, we got the vaccine. And so certainly the sense I get here in the UK from what they're saying is we're now in a kind of race between the vaccine and the virus. Is the virus going to mutate? I think it's called vaccine escape or something before we get the vaccine, or will we get the vaccine and then it will mutate a bit and then we'll just have it like an annual flu vaccine? Who knows? But whatever, I'm not convinced we've learned our lesson yet as a species.
This is one of the things I wanted to talk about, which was the relationship between pain and growth. You know, we tend to think of pain as a kind of wholly negative thing, but you know, I read a lot of biographies during the pandemic, and one thing that was clear in every story, no matter if I was reading about an architect or an artist or, you know, statesperson, was that at some point in their life they had a crisis, and that crisis was enormously painful, and that on the other side of that crisis, the person that they became, right, that crisis was the fuel for, you know, their greatness, whatever that was. And I wonder, you know, what do you see as the relationship between pain and human development?
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's interesting. I always have to be very careful what I say here, because I don't want to give the message of, hey, pain's really great and you should love your pain, because I don't ascribe to that particular approach, because pain is painful. So I don't want to deny the fact that pain is painful and would be all sort of Pollyanna about it.
Right.
I know when, you know, in my early years when I was so lost, I absolutely hated anyone talking to me like that. Because I always felt I was a failure, you know, because my life was a mess and I was broken, and people were saying, hey, pain's really great and an opportunity for growth. And I just wanted to hit them. But I think that it's very interesting in the Buddhist tradition. You've got these different sort of realms, they call it, of experience. You've got a God realm, you've got an animal realm, you've got a hell realm, you've got a human realm, hungry ghost realm, obviously very cravey. And it said that the human realm is the ideal realm for growth because there's a balance of pleasure and pain. There's a balance of pleasure and pain. Because if you've only got pain, you get broken, you get completely worn down. If you've only got pleasure, there's no motivation. There's no motivation. So I think pain certainly can be a tremendous doorway for growth, partly because it is enormously motivating, because you just don't want to stay in this state of anguish or pain or whatever it might be. And of course, you know, very often we look for solutions that are in themselves deluded. For many, many years, I just wanted to find a cure. I just wanted someone to fix me. Yeah, so you get what's called the doctor shopping phase, where you just go to one doctor after another saying, fix me, fix me. And they're saying, well, no, actually, we can't fix you. Your spine is really damaged. So that's, that's a very normal phase, very, very disheartening phase. But I think the main thing to say is that pain, if it's too intense, it can break us.
Yeah.
And that's not going to be growthful. But on the other, like my pain was very intense, but it was that revelation that it was just one moment at a time. That was what turned it around. And then it's enormously motivating. I've been much more motivated in my meditation practice because I've got all this pain in my body. Like this mystery, how can I be awake and present to my life as it happens in this body that hurts all the time? That's a huge mystery and very, very motivating. And if I had a body that wasn't painful, maybe I wouldn't have been as motivated. I think I probably wouldn't have been as motivated. And I was lucky enough, for whatever reason, somehow I had that visitation that showed me another way. So I think that, again, it comes to response. Pain can be growthful, depending on how we respond. It
has that possibility.
It definitely has that possibility. And there's no human life that doesn't have crises. To even think, oh, well, I've had these crises and that person over there has a really wonderful life and they have it easy all the time, which I used to think. I now know everybody has crises. So everybody has this doorway, is this going to break me? Or am I going to be able to step through another doorway where it's an opportunity for me to reframe how I relate to my experience and then also how I relate to the experience of others? And I certainly know that my experience has made me much kinder and much more empathetic than I was when I was a fit, healthy teenager, where I was really quite unempathetic towards other people who suffered.
Yeah, there's several things I want to say right now. I think the virtue of having had read for 20 years all my executive students' homework, that it became really clear, that no matter how attractive the outward appearance was, or how nice their car was or house was or good looking their spouse was, that was only part of the story. And then it just took away the illusion that anybody could have it. Somebody somewhere is suffering in their life, right? And it's just the way it is. No matter how powerful the illusion that they're not is, right?
And I think that's a really important point, because part of the emotional suffering that I used to have was the fantasy that other people had these perfect lives. Here was me in this body, never had any money, found it hard to hold down a job because of my pain and so on. Found it hard to form intimate relationships for a long time because of what I'd gone through. And I would look out into the world and think, oh, it's all right for everybody else. I'd look at people, like you're saying, who the outward appearance would be the perfect life. And that's a very particular form of anguish, that awful kind of comparative mind and sense of personal lack in the face of abundance of other. But through all my work, and I suppose just being alive, it's very kind of equalizing when you realize, well, every human life has got pain and every human life has got the potential for happiness. And that's something that we all share. And then one's own experience becomes a doorway to connection rather than a doorway to isolation.
Yeah. And so, two things I want to come to mind. One is what you started with was the glibness with which oftentimes people will say, just take on a Pollyannish quality about what pain is, right? And And I think that's something in this line of work you have to be really careful about, because that you're dealing with some really intimate part of their human experience, right? And that's very delicate. And you see the delicacy of people in those moments. And at the same time, you know, what you were saying now, that I think about it like, in my own case, kind of advanced graduate training, you know, of having to live through this kind of misery. But then it also prepares you for a time when your friends who used to think all this weird stuff you're doing, you know, now start calling you with questions like, how do I deal with this? You know, and then then it becomes this enormous, you know, in a way, honor, right, to be able to walk through that doorway with people and have a conversation in that with that kind of again, a kind of intimacy about their own experience, you know.
Because there's a kind of sweet intimacy when the others open up about the pain, whatever it might be, you know, the thoughts, the emotions, the physical pain, whatever it is. And if one can just meet that with an open heart, based on recognition, you know, because I know myself more deeply, I know you to some extent, because we are partaking of this common human experience that includes heartbreak and heartache and physical decline and physical injury and illness, and you're dealing with the heart of the matter. It is, you say, a great honor, and the more one knows, you know, the more we know ourselves in our darkness and our light, then of course we're not frightened when other people share that. I think I always used, you know, before I did all this work, I used to be frightened of the pain of others. It would be too much. But now it's like, well, it is what it is. And, you know, there's always these two doorways. Is it going to break you, or can you just meet it just with a tiny little bit more awareness and softness and open-heartedness and good humor? Actually, I think good humor is essential in this work.
Yeah, absolutely, right. That's because that gives you a kind of flexibility. You know, it's interesting as raising a child, and knowing that at some level adversity is a driver for people's growth, and as a parent, there is no part of you that wants your kid to suffer, but you know that if you overprotect them or try to shield them from the pain of the world, you know, they grow up in a kind of distorted way. And that's a tough, I have to say, as a parent, that is a really tough balance to strike. Like, you don't want harm to come to your child. And yet and I don't want to, you know, greatness is almost always born out of some kind of suffering. And I haven't figured that one out yet, other than to be there for when it inevitably comes, you know.
Exactly. And the more you can, the more we've worked on that in ourselves, the more you can be there for your child. I mean, I don't have children of my own, but I've got stepchildren and step grandchildren. And I think the other thing is, you just look at these sort of sweet, innocent, kind of unblemished creatures. And you know, oh gosh, you know, life will inflict its scars, and there's nothing you can do to avoid that. But, you know, I certainly know, you know, from that experience, and then being a child of my parents, that the more a parent can stand beside you when it does happen, that's the greatest gift.
That's what you can do, right? Yeah.
That's all you can do.
Something that you raised earlier, you know, when you had a vision for your life, and I think this is all, you know, also maybe 7 billion of us are having this question too. You know, you have this vision for your life of what it was going to be. You know, we're going to swim out to this island to help the birds. And then when life has a different agenda from that, and how, I wonder if you might speak to that. You have this, we all had probably, many of us had an idea of how 2020 was going to go for us. And maybe we're now concocting our stories about how 2021 is going to go for us. And, the world had a different agenda. And what is it that, when those two agendas, clashing agendas, come into contact with each other, how do you negotiate that?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, isn't it? Because of course that's, in one's own life, but it's also, career, ambition, all these things. It's good to have goals, of course. It's good to have things that we're working towards, and then they get thwarted. And I think it's, I've been thinking about this quite a bit just the last couple of weeks, because it's what's becoming apparent to all of us. 2020 wasn't just a little blip. It wasn't like, well, 2020 is over and now we're, normal service has resumed.
Right.
Which probably 6 months ago, we kind of fantasized that it would.
Yeah.
We thought it was all going to be over in 3 months and 6 months. No one in the UK would have thought we'd be back into a hard lockdown beginning of January. So I've been reflecting on this, and I'm, talking to people I know and the people around me, that some people are obviously finding it really, really hard, of course, understandably, and some people aren't. Some people are finding it easier. So my current sort of reflection is that it's really important to have one's own personal goals and dreams. Dreams are really important, aren't they? But we also need to hold everything lightly. We need to hold everything lightly. And one of the really surprising fruits of meditation, mindfulness, I'm a practicing Buddhist. One of the unexpected fruits that I would never have expected is lightheartedness. I'm a much more lighthearted person than I used to be, much less intense. And I think it is, as you say, this kind of, one needs to develop this twin ability of having goals and dreams and holding everything lightly, thinking, well, it may or may not happen. I'm gonna proceed as if it might happen, but guess what? It might not happen. And then if it doesn't happen, we just go with whatever, you just sort of go with whatever arrives, with this attitude of more fluidity, more openness. We can also reframe things, because it is quite interesting now. I'm 61 and I'm finding, moving into my 60s, it feels like quite a different phase of my life. And there's a kind of like gathering things in a certain kind of way. And I had all this dream of being a wilderness person. That hasn't happened. But I realized, I've kind of been a mountaineer of the inner world. So that myth of being a mountaineer has stayed alive. That myth of being an adventurer has stayed alive, even though I've not been able to do any of the outdoorsy things that I wanted. And in some ways, it's better being a mountaineer of the inner world, because you never reach the summit. There's always further to go. There's always more magic. There's always more wonder. There's always more, like right now, here we are in this world, in this state. How can I dance with taking life very, very seriously and holding it very, very lightly? That's like another growth point. And then, lockdown permitting, in May and June of this year, I'm going to go off to the Isle of Skye in Scotland and live in a little hut for 2 months on the edge of the loch. Yeah, I found this place where I'll get my care needs met, but I'll also have time of my own in this little hut. And that's amazing. That feels like, that goes way back to that story of what I wanted as a 15-year-old. And I'm finding a way to do that in my way as a 61-year-old with a disability. That feels, that's kind of honoring that dream, and it probably won't happen. So yeah, I'm putting all this effort into setting the whole thing up, and I'm looking forward to it. And one of the things I've really learned from 2020, and I think it's a really great thing to learn, is, it may or may not happen. And how can I learn to take that into the future, that kind of more lighthearted attitude to planning. And there's a lot of wisdom in that, you see, because we, it's so deluded the way we plan our lives, assuming it's going to happen. Well, why? There's all sorts of things that can stop our plans happening. But that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't plan. That's the kind of paradox. So I'm doing all this planning for this mythic time that's very, very meaningful for me. And I'll be fine if it doesn't happen. I'll also be fine if it doesn't happen. And that's what we need to learn as a species, I think, collectively.
I'm just going to circle back to that, right? And it strikes me, how that story from your earlier life, is a kind of fractal for what everybody is experiencing. Everybody will experience it at some point. We just have getting to experience it all together at once, and then renegotiating, your relationship with the world and your relationship with pain, which is why I thought this is such a fundamental conversation. The idea that something about human growth and development that at some point asks you to surrender to something that's bigger, bigger than your own plans for the day at some level, and what is that about?
Well, we have to let go of control, don't we? We have to, an image I sometimes have is as if we live our lives with these tight fists and we're trying to sort of pull things towards us that we want, and we grab hold of them, with this massive tight fist, and we're punching away the things we don't like. And we need to live with open hands. That's the gesture, is opening your hands and just letting life pour through those open hands, and surrender without it being passive. This is where it's so subtle, because obviously surrender can be passive. It's like, oh, well, whatever, I don't really care. Might as well just give up. Everything's terrible. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, like seizing the day, to use that language, being really alive, really present, and having a very strong sense of initiative. But the initiative is more in the sense of, how am I going to respond to what happens in this moment, rather than how can I control my life? Because we can always choose how we respond. We can have a lot of agency in our lives, but we need to surrender to the much bigger forces around us. We can't control pandemics and viruses and global economics and
all of that, right?
So we can't control those things.
Somebody once said to me, act as if the very fate of the universe rests on your every action, but understanding that it may amount to nothing.
Yeah.
And
that's good.
Right. It's like, total commitment and total engagement with total detachment, and it's a really, it's like one that could be one definition of wisdom, that.
I think that's very good.
But I can do it from this very, as you say, a kind of lighthearted place, not meaning trivial, right?
Not meaning trivial, no. But it's, if you've ever seen the Dalai Lama, he's always laughing, isn't he? And I see him as quite an embodiment of this. You get the sense he's holding everything lightly with this huge perspective, and he's deeply present and compassionate, both those things together. So I like to think I want to take life incredibly seriously and hold it incredibly lightly. So both those things together. And that I can, my actions can affect the quality of my life and the quality of other people's lives, definitely. So that I should be very responsible in terms of my actions. And life is just doing its thing, and I have no idea what's going to be happening in 3 months' time, 2 months' time, a week's time. And things are changing so fast at the moment. That's where I think, for us all, it is an opportunity. it is a huge opportunity. It is, and it is, I hadn't thought this, but collectively it is a little bit like my night in intensive care. It feels like collectively we're all a bit in this hellish state of, where all of our ideas of control and planning, and that we can get life on our own terms, all that is being smashed up all around us. And we can, collectively be broken by that, or we can collectively think, okay, what can I learn? What can we learn? What can we learn? Which doesn't, I'm always a bit wary talking like this, because there is the most appalling suffering happening out there.
Right. That's another one of these
I don't
duality tensions.
say, oh, look at us, we can learn so much, while people are, the staff in intensive care wards at the moment, it's awful, absolutely awful. Right. They are on their knees. People are losing loved ones. People are losing their jobs, their livelihood. It's terrible. So I don't want to in any way trivialize, diminish any of that. And if we can come away from all this having learned something, well, then that's better than coming away from all this not having learned something. The suffering's happening. So what can we learn collectively? And
if you had to advise somebody who was like the head of an organization, who had to, whose decisions really influenced, had a lot of responsibility and had to steward both people's lives and resources and things like that, what would you tell that person?
Just be kind. Be kind. Just that emotion of kindness, empathy. Clearly, one would have to make decisions of one sort or another, organizationally. But if you can take the people with you and do it with kindness, that will make the most enormous difference. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting at Breathworks, we've actually managed okay through the pandemic, but we've got a CEO working very, very hard. And, I keep on saying to her, you need to take some time off. You need to pace yourself, because that's the other thing. People at the top can think, I can't take any time off. I need to be here fighting the fires all the time. Everyone needs to have a break sometimes, if possible. And the thing we've really prioritized over the last year at Breathworks is kindness amongst the team, between us, kindness going out into the world. I think that's the most important thing at the moment, which is an interesting answer, isn't it? I'm not advising sort of structural things or organizational things or leadership things. I'm just saying, don't forget to be kind. Don't forget to be kind.
That's been a powerful lesson, I think, for many people over the last year, that whereas I think a lot of people, at least a lot of leaders, want to emphasize productivity, right? How do we get back to work? And maybe that's at this point really a secondary concern.
I think so. And it's interesting, New Zealand has done better than probably anywhere through all this. And their government messaging has been very, very good and a bit different. Like early on, their government messaging was be kind. That was one of their slogans. Like here, the slogans were stay at home, save lives, protect the NHS. They love these kind of 3-word slogans or 3-phrase slogans, which they are good, they're catchy. But in New Zealand, it was something like stay at home, save lives, be kind. Very interesting. They had government messaging about the emotional dimension of it. And that seems to have paid off, because they got clearly people obeyed the rules, probably more than they have done here. And people were behind the government. I mean, they had a prime minister who was obviously empathetic, good at communication. And also what was interesting about her, as far as I can see, a good communicator, empathetic, but very decisive. So she didn't dither. She said very early on in the pandemic, we go hard and we go early. So they just lock down very quickly and very early, and they do every time there's another bubble up of the virus, they just shut everything down. Whereas here, there's been much more prevaricating. So that's also quite an interesting thing in a leader, to have this combination of empathy and kindness plus decisiveness. Yeah.
Yep. That it doesn't mean, I think a lot of people can hear that word and think, oh, it means a kind of weakness.
Yeah.
And when it's skillfully waged like that, in a way, you see that it's not the opposite of being a strong leader.
Yeah. And so, and the sort of language I've been using more and more is becoming a warrior, a compassionate warrior. We need warriors in the world, not warriors, but warriors.
Yeah, that's right.
We need people who are really courageous and really strong and fearless. There's a kind of fearless quality we need at the moment, but one that's soft, a kind of soft fearlessness. I think that's what we need. And you can see kindness as a soft fearlessness, I think. It doesn't need to be soft and wishy-washy.
Yeah. That's a really profound message, especially for this country at this moment. Yeah. And, but the idea of being a warrior, and that's imagery that has really stuck with me for the last few years, like how to be a warrior of your own experience, but then in service to really helping the world deal with this.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, like even compassion, people see that as kind of soft and feminine, and men are particularly interested in it sometimes, or kindness. But I think that we need to sort of rebrand it,
right?
Because it's unbelievably brave, to turn towards suffering in yourself and in the world, and to meet that with a fearless, open heart and a light-hearted, this kind of ability to see it absolutely clearly, and then also not be overwhelmed, not push it away, not block it out, nor be overwhelmed, but stand in that ocean of truth in all its messiness and keep moving forwards. That requires such enormous bravery. And
that is, yes, I think oftentimes people in this mindfulness world really shoot themselves in the foot using language that for a lot of people is really off-putting. And for better or worse, for compassion isn't a big seller in a lot of places because it doesn't strike the right notes. And but whereas courage, I think, is a far more compelling thing for a lot of, especially leaders, right? Who don't want to be seen as a weak link in the chain, right? But it's really about courage, and compassion is rolled up in all of that. So Vidyamala, thank you very much for this truly fascinating, profound conversation about, I think we visited a lot of different and very interesting neighborhoods. So let's do this again.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it, and connecting with the great matter. Let's call it that, the great matter. What does it mean to be alive in this time? Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast. Give us a review and tell us your thoughts. The best thing you can do is share this with someone who would find it interesting and helpful. If you have an idea for other topics you'd like to explore, please let us know. Contact me at info@jeremyhunter.net. Thank you to the multi-talented Mr. Jason Beck for making the magic happen behind the scenes. And our music is the creation of Jeffrey with a G Munger. You can learn more about his work at kettleblackmusic.com.